Our next panel will focus on a central theme that is shared among many of the advocates in this room today, including the Climate Coalition, and that is building healthy, sustainable communities. We will hear from several fantastic panelists seated behind me on emissions, energy efficiency, clean energy, alternatives, and more. But first, I would like to introduce our moderator and newly appointed House Chair of the Environment Committee, Representative John Michael Parker. Representative Parker was elected to the General Assembly in 2020, serves the 101st District, which includes Madison and Durham. A graduate of Yale, he previously worked as an elementary and middle school science teacher. In addition, he has experience in the nonprofit sector as the current executive director of Arts for Learning Connecticut. However, my favorite fact about him is that he spent time touring the country as a professional musician. As a gigging musician myself, we hope you will all join us for next year's summit, which may or may not feature, but definitely will, a lunchtime jam session to get people moving. I speak for many when I say we look forward to Representative Parker's leadership and his youthful, scientific, and artistic perspective as he steps into this new role. We decided to give him the ultimate test today by framing this discussion and posing a few questions to our panelists. Joining our panel this afternoon, Dr. Kirsten Eck, Assistant Professor of Internal Medicine and a hospitalist physician at UCONN Health. Mark Scully, President of People's Action for Clean Energy, known as PACE. Terri Eickel, Executive Director of the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, or IREJN. As the nonprofit people know, there's a lot of different acronyms. Stephen Lewis, volunteer chair of the legislative and political committees of the Sierra Club, Connecticut, and Charles Rothenberger, climate and energy attorney for Save the Sound. I will now turn it over to Representative Parker to begin.
Thank you, and thank you for that really kind, generous introduction. I feel so welcome today, and I'm grateful to be among this community and with these incredible panelists. Before I open it up and get through some questions, I wanted to say one more word of introduction about myself. Since I am maybe a newer face for some of you, I just want you to know how proud I am and excited I am to serve as the House Chair of the, almost forgot the name of my committee. That's a tough start. Just kidding. Of the Environment Committee. And a lot of the pieces that I want to share about myself have already been mentioned. I was elected in 2020. Someone just came up and asked, were you just elected? No, I'm not quite that new. Been here for a couple of years, served on the Environment Committee since then, was recently the Vice Chair of the Public Health Committee. And you'll hear today actually about how that health framing is, I think, really important to the work that we're doing. But the last thing I wanted to say was, as a shoreline legislator, born and raised, and now proudly representing Madison and Durham to our north, as a outdoor enthusiast, as an avid fisherman, but most importantly, as the father of an almost 2-year-old growing up in this world, I am keenly aware of the responsibility that we have to protect and conserve our environment, to take some real climate action this year and into the future, and to bring Connecticut back to a place of leadership in environmental policy. There's been such great work that's happened in the state over the years, and we have big shoes to fill. And, I'm hopeful about that work this year because we have great allies in our agencies, incredible work that's been happening, incredible work happening on this committee. Of course, among the advocate community and the work that y'all do and our predecessors, the work that you leave us, but also because we have a lot of allies throughout the legislature. In the House, in the Senate, in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, because my fellow legislators want to make sure that their constituents live in healthy and safe and resilient communities. They want to make sure that their constituents aren't overly burdened by energy costs and unsustainable energy costs, right? That they can live economically. I have fellow legislators that believe in protecting their communities from climate weather emergencies that we've seen happening in our states, keeping people safe. And most importantly, colleagues that love life in Connecticut, whether they were born and raised here or are new here, and want to have something to pass along to future generations. So I'm really hopeful for all of that because of all of you in the room, and especially because of the people that are up here today. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you all want to share with us in terms of the challenges we face, the solutions that we have ahead of us, the work that we have cut out for us, and looking forward to working with you all this session. So that said, we're going to start right here. Dr. Eck, as I even just referenced, we hear a lot about the climate challenges we face in terms of environmental impacts. You're a physician. Can you tell us a little bit about the human impacts on health, the challenges you see among your patients and your communities, and draw that connection for us between climate and health?
Yes. Thank you, Representative. I'd be happy to. I'd like to tell you about two patients who came into the hospital on my shift. The first was Mr. M. He lives in a neighborhood in North Hartford. His neighborhood suffered an extreme weather event and his basement flooded. He is of the communities that were historically underserved by updated septic and storm drains. It all backed up into his basement and created a dangerous mold, a black mold through his basement. In the process of cleaning that up for his family, his chest became tighter and tighter, his asthma flared, and it was hard for him to breathe. His family brought him to the hospital when he started hemorrhaging blood from his lungs. And it's lucky they did, because he had developed an invasive infection with the fungus. It was so invasive into his lungs that it had hit the blood vessels and caused him to bring up this blood. It's a very high mortality condition. He survived it, but it was a lengthy stay. And unfortunately, he couldn't work during that period, and he suffered financial harm as well as health harm. The second patient who came in was a grandmother. Her family brought her in because she was very confused and seemed to be indicating she had severe belly pain. She was taking a very commonly prescribed medication for her bladder problems, and it was a summer heat wave. Unfortunately for her, the combination of the heat, the medication, this medication's side effects are known to decrease sweating and decrease urine output and cause constipation. When you combine that with heat, her body could not cool down. She became more and more confused, and her bowels filled with stool to the point where she suffered a perforation of her colon, the stool entering her abdomen. She ended up in the ICU for a very, very long stay. This is another high mortality condition. She did survive it, but nowhere in her discharge summary, nor the gentleman before, was it listed heat-related event or an extreme weather-related event. We're very bad at documenting that, actually. I'd like to take this a step further. If you could just peek around the room at yourselves. We are, all of us, a collection of internal organs. Exquisitely, finely tuned organs who prefer a very set temperature range. If the heat were to go up in this room, you all would begin taking behaviors, maybe you would notice them or not, to cool off. Maybe you would shed a layer, maybe you would sip water, maybe you would actually just step out. Meanwhile, your organs would try to compensate for this heat and do things pretty effectively for a while. When the heat rises to a point where it can no longer compensate, what happens with those organs? And unfortunately, we know this, and we know it a little bit too well. When the core body temperature reaches 104 and your brain begins to dysfunction, maybe you have loss of consciousness, confusion, seizures, things like that. That is the medical definition of a heat stroke. That's a medical emergency, and you have literally minutes, very, very little time to act before irreversible organ damage occurs. It's fatal. But that's a core body temperature inside, measured with a rectal probe. What is the external temperature, the outdoor weather temperature, at which the human body cannot tolerate? And we know that too. So this was a theoretical number that scientists came up with. It is a wet bulb globe temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 hours. That wet bulb is not just 95, that is heat, humidity, sun angle, and wind. You can arrive at that at a variety of unpleasant combinations of temperature and humidity. However, that number was theoretical. Penn State has started doing actual experimental data with healthy young athletic volunteers putting them in heat tanks with swallowing a thermometer. It turns out we have overestimated the human ability to handle heat, and that is profoundly worrisome. It turns out at a wet bulb globe temperature 87.8 is now thought to be the new max. In Chicago in 1995, a heat wave came. If you see the green line here, in June, the temperature was hot, but then on July 11th, it spiked to 106, but the feels like was 125. The orange line at the bottom is the usual number of people who die per day in Chicago. The red line is what happened that summer when that heat wave came. And in a very short time, like a grim reaper, the heat came and took 700 lives, many of them older. Europe had a similar heat wave, 15 to 50,000 excess deaths. In neither case did the wet bulb globe temperature exceed 82. I put the picture of the farm worker there because we know that the farm workers die at a rate of 20 times other occupations due to heat illness. And that's profoundly worrying as well for our food security and for them as states like Florida remove heat protection for them. 2024, hottest year on record. I think everyone in this room knows, this is no secret why. We have rapidly burned fossil fuels and added them to our atmosphere. Temperature has increased. Today, measured in Hawaii, what is the atmospheric CO2 level in parts per million? And that number, I looked it up, is 426 parts per million. At which point, absolutely everybody in this audience should be sitting up very straight, because this is a white knuckle moment for humanity. That number on the far end of that graph is higher than humans have ever seen. And that's today. There's excellent evidence going out 800,000, 2 million, and even 3 million years. Think about Lucy, Olduvai Gorge. Humanity evolved. Our organ systems learned to function in a range of CO2 of the 200s. We are so far outside the physiologic realm where humans evolved. All right, a little thought experiment. Where do you see this line topping off by the end of the century? Where do you see it? What's your number? So say you go a little higher, you hit, what is that, 480, 500? Or do you see it going to 600, 800, 1,000 or higher? Stake out your number in your head, please, and follow me to the next slide. I'd like you to sit on your scenario, your emissions scenario. All right, so you pessimists, you know who you are. You picked over 1,000 parts per million by the year 2100, by the end of this century. I want you to sit on your line and think about what you did. All right, now the rest of you, 600, 800 parts per million, you see the pessimists in their scenario, feeble to pathetic efforts, if no efforts are made to cap our emissions. You moderates, something's getting done, maybe not that fast, a little effort. But the optimists, I love you guys, you're imagining in your emission scenario, capping it under 500. You imagine that we can effectively and quickly get this under control. All right, so let's pick on the pessimists a little more and see where they go. Because I blacked out the temperature there. So these are projected temperatures that accompany their pathway. So let's pick on them. What y'all are saying is a 5 to 10 degree Fahrenheit average increase in the temperature by 2100. And let's take that a step further and look at what that looks like on a very familiar National Weather Service graph. All right, you take some hot days this summer, bump that out 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. And you can see, add a little humidity, you're in extreme danger. And that is average. That is not the hottest day anomaly. Your hottest day in Chicago, 1995, was 106. Bump that out, and those anomalies are projected to be even 12 degrees hotter. I want you to now imagine all the students in the dorms at UCONN, 7th floor. They're not air conditioned. Think about the linesmen when the power goes out in those temperatures trying to work. And if they can't do their job, the heat's coming for all of us. And I find this to be profoundly worrisome. This is the United Nations IPCC report. This slide gets me. I stare at this a lot. These are the different scenarios. Left is cooler, moving on to the right. Those are the pessimistic scenarios where we don't cap it. In those scenarios, the days per year, gets 365 is purple. Those are days per year where we're outside the limits of human heat tolerance. Number of days per year. All those people will have to move or will not make it. Never mind the species, we're not getting into that. Other species. But the problem is, these maps were done before that newer heat tolerance data. The projections are 3 billion to 3.6 billion people at risk by the end of the year, by the end of 2100, if we don't get this under control. COVID came and took 7 million people, maybe 10. But we saw the refrigerated trucks with bodies. We saw that. It was easy to act. It was coming into our houses. We saw it and we acted quickly and we capped that. This we're not seeing yet. We don't feel 425, 426 yet. We don't feel it. It's coming, but we don't feel it. And believe me, the bodies will start stacking up. Connecticut has some lofty goals. We met the first goal. We did it. And COVID helped us go a little farther, and now we're backsliding. We know where our emission sectors are, thanks to DEEP's mapping. And Yale has found in its surveys that people in Connecticut want green and sustainable. This is my last slide. I'm looking at anyone born 1995, 2000, or after. Can you please raise your hands? Look at this, okay? These are the folks staring down the right side of that graph. And I bet you not, you can put it down. I bet you not one of those folks is fooled that this graph ends at 2100. The heat berg that looms beyond that graph is coming for the children and their grandchildren, and we have to act now. We need to have the gumption, and this is not to demoralize you folks who rose your hand, but this is to moralize the rest of us. I thank you, and I leave now to my colleagues who will tell us how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eickel. So Mark, we've got our work cut out for us. Thank you for what you shared about your patients and your experience and making this so real for us. We put you first because we wanted to set the scene, set the table for what's at stake, and really as you drew for us the connection to health. And so we know what happens if we don't do anything. The next four folks are going to tell us what we have to do. Mark, take it away. What can we get to work on?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Representative Parker. And thank you, Dr. Eck, for that really clarion call, powerful call. We all have a moral imperative to do everything we can to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Terry, Steve, and I are going to talk a little bit about some ways we can do that. Before we do that, I'd like to maybe step back a little bit and give you a little bit of a sense of the overall picture of what is the path towards this clean energy, more healthy future. This graph shows you the reduction over time in our greenhouse gas emissions, right? Where we are today, PACE estimates that Connecticut emits about 30 million tons of greenhouse gases on energy. And you can see over time, we can reduce that from the 30 million down to 0 in really 3 steps. The red, and each of these is what we call an emission reduction wedge. So you can see how over time we can reduce the emissions from 30 million to something like 25 from the red contribution. And that's what Terry and Steve are going to talk about. That's energy efficiency and electrification of buildings, right? The next, the blue slice is vehicles. And we are in the midst of a revolution in the automotive industry where we're moving away from internal combustion engines. Growth in Connecticut has been strong. We have 57% growth year on year in Connecticut. We only have about 2% registrations are electric vehicles today, but new sales are 10% of, so EVs are 10% of new sales in Connecticut. So we know those numbers are going to increase. You can see if you put together the red and the blue wedges, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions about halfway to zero, right? So by 2050, we've gotten rid of about half of the problem. The last piece is really by powering those cars and those houses only with clean renewable energy. And for us in Connecticut, that's really four things. It's solar, it's offshore wind, it's storage, and it's a modern grid. Right? There will be some other contributions from some onshore wind, we'll have some hydro, but really by our estimates, we can do it with those four resources. So what I'd like to do is touch on each of these four, and I'll finish with solar because that I think is what I was supposed to talk about. So let me start with offshore wind. It is regrettable that Connecticut decided to sit out the recent tri-state procurement of offshore wind. Federal leases off the eastern coast represent a massive energy resource that is absolutely essential to Connecticut's energy future. It will also be a powerful economic engine, generating good jobs at sites across the state. We urge policymakers to view future offshore wind procurements more favorably, taking into account the wider economic benefits that this resource provides and its centrality to our economic future. Are you still with me? This next one gets a little wonky, but it's important. We need to talk about the electric grid. Actually, before that, I'm going to do storage. So energy storage, with lots of solar and with lots of wind, they complement each other very nicely, right? The wind blows more in the winter and more at night, which of course is when we don't have solar. But even with solar and wind, we're going to need lots of storage. We're going to need in different forms, long, medium, short duration. We're going to need batteries. We're going to need thermal storage. And keep in mind that investments in storage will actually reduce the cost of our electricity, right? By putting a lot of storage on the grid, and particularly distributed storage in lots of different places, it sort of acts as a sponge on the grid, spreading out the load, reducing the need for additional wires. So the more storage we build, the more renewables, the more solar and wind we're able to deploy. So now let me talk about the grid. The scale of renewable energy deployments that we're talking about here are only possible with a modern grid. Today's distribution grid was built in a time of large central power plants sending electricity in one direction out to users. Now we've got users producing at the same time. They're producing, they're storing, they've got combined heat and power, they're talking to each other. So we need a grid that can handle these multi-directional flows. Fortunately, Connecticut has a very forward-looking utility regulator who is on the job building and designing the equitable modern grid that we will need. This work is essential if we're going to deploy the numbers that we're going to need for solar and wind. And I think we all know, we heard that from Mark Pasniokis earlier, our utility regulator is under fire. So every chance we get, we need to support our utility regulator, Marissa Gillette. So move on to solar, please. How is Connecticut doing on solar? This chart shows our historical deployments. We don't have the 2024 data yet, but you can see through 2023. Each of these stacked bars shows you how much solar we interconnected or deployed in any year. So those are not cumulative amounts. We're doing more and more each year, right? These solar programs are very effective. And you can see the line shows the cumulative amount. By our numbers, we've deployed something like 1,400, 1,600 megawatts of solar in Connecticut. And you can see it's trending upwards. Many of you are very familiar with these programs. They are the commercial solar program. They're the residential solar. They're shared solar. They've been designed by Pura. They have annual reviews there, and you can see they're working. So the question is that going to be enough? Where are we in the journey? Well, the box moved a little in the when the slide got reformatted, but you can see it belongs over 2023, right? So if you look at the 2023 point, that's really where we are. I think this picture is a good image for us to keep in mind, right? It's easy to look at this and be disappointed and say, well, we're only at about 5 or 6% right now, right? And the 100% here is really what we're ultimately going to need from solar, right? But you know, this is a traditional technology adoption curve, right? And there's a reason that adoption curves start slow, right? We have been doing the hard work of building and designing and every year reviewing these programs. They're very collaborative processes. So we are poised now. That work has been done. We are poised now for rapid growth. In the spirit of Chuck Nice, there are really two themes to what I like to say today, right? So if you get nothing else from what I'm saying today, the two points are, the first is we know what we need to do. We now need to just focus on rapid deployment. We know what we need to do. We've built the programs. We've got NRES, we've got RES, we've got SCEF, we've got an energy storage program. We've got all kinds of programs out there. They're not perfect, but they're good, and we've got a regulator that is on the job. So what we need to focus on is rapid deployment. All right, we don't need to reinvent everything. And the second point is, despite everything you hear in the public discourse, the path to clean energy is the path to lower and more stable energy costs, right? And you can see other states, looks like the slides got reformatted. The circle moved. The circle was supposed to sort of show you where Connecticut is on the chart, but I think you can find
We're not that bad.
We're over on the right there. We're just ahead of New Hampshire. Other states have found a way to do this faster than we have. So I don't think this, we can't say this is not possible. One question that of course comes up is, do we have room for all this solar? Can we put this, can we create enough solar and offshore wind without making the state look like an industrial park? And the short answer is yes. We are just getting started. We're just getting started with rooftop. We're just getting started with commercial. And one of the ways that we can deploy a lot of solar without putting pressure on our farmlands and our forests is through solar canopies. PACE has just issued a study. There's copies on our table. Please come get one. Of how much solar we could fit on solar canopies in the state, on parking lots in the state. We've modeled about 9,000 sites. You can see each dot here is a potential canopy on a parking lot over 100 spaces. If we did it every one, we could produce over a third of our current electricity needs. And we can do that while they're providing additional benefits like shade for vehicles, reducing urban heat island effect. We can build these in EJ communities. So solar canopies can be a significant part of our future. So we'd like you to join us in promoting solar canopies this coming session.
Mark, I want to make sure we can hear the rest of our panels. Can we circle back to get some more of those ideas as we get to that part of the panel later on?
I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you so much. And please, a round of applause for Mark. So we've heard a little bit about, of course, the need to reduce emissions for avoiding this catastrophic future. We've heard about some of the ways that we can do it and the different wedges and what those comparative pieces look like. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in the faith community out on the front lines and why the folks you work with are organizing around these issues and what they're actually working on?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So good afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Terri Eickel. I am the Executive Director for the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network. We are a faith-based environmental organization, and we work with religious communities throughout the state on environmental issues like climate change, toxic pollution, and biodiversity loss. So when I first meet with religious communities who might be new to the idea of environmental care or environmental ministry, I always like to remind them that we're already doing this work. People of faith are the largest group of individual donors in times of extreme weather disasters. Religious communities are addressing food insecurity with community gardens and soup kitchens and food pantries. People of faith support members of the community who are sick with illnesses like cancer or asthma, and religious communities help people pay their basic living expenses. Every religious community gets approached on a regular basis by people who are struggling to pay their fuel or utility bills. So I'm here to talk today about energy efficiency and its critical role in reducing energy costs, improving health and quality of life, and fighting climate change. I've got a few stats about energy and how it is actually a justice issue in addition just to being an economic one. Connecticut has one of the highest income disparities in our nation, and 31% of our residents are considered extremely low income. In addition, low-income communities are much more likely to live in housing that is inefficient and plagued with health hazards like mold. Wealthier households, interestingly, use more energy and produce 25% more greenhouse gas emissions than low-income households, but they also have the income to pay for it. So low-income households have a higher energy burden, which is the cost of your energy as related to your income. So even though wealthier households are using more energy and creating more pollution and creating more greenhouse gas emissions, low-income communities and households are paying for it in every single way. So for this reason, IREJN decided to focus on how climate change intersects with other areas of inequity. And one of the issues we landed on was energy efficiency. And so to do this outreach, we worked with regional and statewide religious organizations. We partnered with vendors who understand religious communities. You know, they're qualified as small businesses, but there's nothing like they're very, very unique in that way. There are lots of decision makers, very old buildings, et cetera. And we also did a lot of outreach with the utilities and the vendors for houses of worship. So initially, our goal was let's get 100 houses of worship to do energy efficiency measures. As of actually November 1st, so this is not even as updated as I would like, it was at 166 houses of worship that were implementing energy efficiency. So yeah, it's like, here we go. Can I go back? I'll go back. Okay, so I wanted to highlight 3 of them. So Union Baptist Church in Hartford is a historic Black church in Hartford in the North End, and they completed the Small Business Energy Advantage program through Eversource, and they replaced the lighting throughout their church, including initial cost was $22,816, but after the rebates, after our small grant program, it was down to $5,816. And as you can see, that is a quote from the team leader, Angela Thomas, who said, "We thank God for you bringing this to our attention because a total project would have cost us close to $23,000. Now, because of your grant, it will only cost us $5,800 spread out over 5 years at 0% interest." I need to, like, she is an amazing spokesperson, and the Union Baptist is super happy with the program. So Temple B'nai Israel in Willimantic also had similar success. They did the same program through Eversource. They replaced the lighting throughout the synagogue. It was a slightly larger project, so it was about $30,000. But after the rebates, after the grant, the final cost was $13,000. And they are working on a home weatherization campaign in their synagogue as well. And that's really part of our goal, is to help the houses of worship go beyond their congregational building to the members of their community. And my third example is Our Savior Lutheran Church in Thomaston. They did the small business program, and they're doing a home weatherization campaign. And they decided to replace their water heater with a heat pump hot water heater. So Bob Babcock, who organized their energy efficiency program, he owns Connecticut Energy Solutions, generously offered to donate the $75 copay back to the church. So they're using this campaign to raise money and awareness and enthusiasm for their new heat pump hot water heater. And we love that. I have other congregations that are also going to engage in that type of program. So it's great to be able to offer that type of incentive. And of course, the energy efficiency is just the start. We are seeing more and more congregations investigating deeper measures. South Congregational Church in Glastonbury installed solar panels. Congregation Adath Israel in Middletown installed heat pumps. Church in the city in the heart of New London is investigating solar as well. And Asylum Hill Congregational Church is looking at a solar canopy, which is a perfect solution for a beautiful historic church with a slate roof and a large parking lot. And so these type of actions are truly important if houses of worship are going to be climate resiliency hubs where people can go in times of extreme weather. So the benefits of our energy efficiency programs are immense. And I want to thank Bernie Pelletier for giving me some super useful facts. But in 2023 alone, our program saved residents and businesses $62 million with projects in every single town. There was $4.20 of benefit for every $1 of an investment. And these programs employed 34,000 people and held educational programs to build the workforce. And these are local jobs here in our state. And finally, they reduced carbon emissions by more than 114,000 tons. Thank you. And improved air quality by removing 30 tons of sulfur dioxide, 773 tons of nitrogen oxide, and almost 1.4 million tons of carbon dioxide. And that was just 2023. So these programs are fantastic. So with regards to energy efficiency, our group would like to see that Connecticut protect and expand our energy efficiency programs, including the barrier remediation programs. We would like to increase accessibility for people who are poor living in those low-income households. And we're just hoping for strong policy that's going to support these programs, which will in turn help the organizations and people that are doing this work. And I want to say that 166 houses of worship, that was obviously not just the result of IREJN. That is the result of hard work of so many people and organizations and businesses. That's a result of clergy talking in their monthly interfaith meetings and people talking to their neighbors. And that's the thing. In this session, we are going to need to continuously speak the truth about the benefits of these programs and the reality of climate change. In this age of misinformation, we cannot let lies win the day. These programs have been in place for 25 years. And as Mark said, they're really poised to take off. And I think that is why we are seeing so many attacks and so much misinformation aimed at our energy efficiency programs, our clean energy programs, and our climate policy. Because we are transitioning from popular and effective programs to a real movement that is tackling climate change head on. And that is what the opposition and the big money want to stop, and we cannot let them.
Thank you, Terri.
Chuck.
Yes, I want to lift up very briefly, just as you're talking about connecting to community and the houses of worship and the community that you're a part of, how important that diversity is to the allies that we're trying to build across the state and bringing more people into this conversation. And so I appreciate you sharing some of those examples with us. We've heard a lot about heat pumps as a very specific piece of this solution. I'll say even as a legislator, I've also heard a lot of challenges related to heat pumps, misinformation or otherwise. Can you help pick it apart? What is going on with the actual opportunity for heat pumps as a part of our climate solutions?
I can, and thank you for that great introduction there that I wrote. Now, heat pump water heaters, your home superhero. Anybody ever hear of that before? You know, the fact is that what is a heat pump and where does it get its superpower from? A heat pump is essentially a bidirectional home comfort machine. All it does is moves heat in one direction or the other. And so it's not combusting fuels to make heat. And none of those pollution that we've talked about is going up the chimney and into our lungs. And so, you know, we need to understand that heat pumps are a great solution for replacing existing HVAC equipment, getting to that health and sustainable goals that we're talked about, that being the second largest sector of our greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition to those carbon emissions, we've got those pollutants like NOx. And, you know, coming from the residential sector, NOx represents 8 times more NOx emissions than all of our power plants combined. And so, you know, if we get after that, we get after those health impacts that we talked about. And, you know, let's be honest, we know we have high electricity prices in Connecticut. We know we need more efficiency. And heat pumps, and especially heat pump water heaters, are a great answer to that problem. And finally, We'll hear it over and over in this session. There are budget guardrails, there are budget constraints that legislators are going to have to contend with. And, it limits some of the creativity that might otherwise be there. But nonetheless, we can make progress even with this, with heat pump water heaters. Okay, so what are some of the superpowers that consumers get from a heat pump water heater? Well, first, it's not burning fossil fuels, so it's healthier air inside and out. And they're 3 to 4 times more efficient. To put that in perspective, a traditional water heater is on average between 0.65 and 0.95% efficient. The rest of it is going up the chimney as waste heat and pollution. And amazingly, heat pump water heaters are 300% to 400% efficient. And that's where they get their magic, their superpower from. And so as you can see, there's real savings in this for consumers. And those savings can make a difference, not only in our climate problem and our health problems, but in people being able to afford to heat their water, heat their home, et cetera. Energy Star estimated $550 savings for a family of 4 that is using a traditional electric water heater. $550 a year, $5,600 over the lifetime of that water heater. That is a huge benefit. And we had a study done here in Connecticut. Some of the environmental groups got together and we got RMI to do a study. And what they found was that a family switching from a fossil fuel-based water heater in Connecticut can save up to 10% on their energy bills by making that switch. This is real money in people's pockets. And if you're dealing with concern about electric prices, this is an answer.
And Steve, just to say, do I hear you focusing on the water heater specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Because, and I'll get to that in a minute, they have a 15-year lifespan. So they're about 3 years longer lifespan than a traditional water heater. So that leads to the return on investment that you get from making that higher investment up front. And then, I replaced my water heater in my basement 2 years ago, and I've not had to use my dehumidifier for the last 2 years. So I'm saving all that electricity when I need the electricity for my energy bill, for my air conditioning, because I'm not dehumidifying. Okay, now there's superpowers here as well for policymakers to help you actually move the dial and help us move forward on residential emissions. We need to introduce the magic of heat pumps to consumers in a digestible, easy to approach way. We're not going to replace everybody's HVAC system with a heat pump in 5 years. It's just not going to happen. That's a heavier lift. Heat pump water heaters are a great way to get started because they're less expensive up front, and there's a lot of ways that they're easier to implement in people's houses. So for example, the workforce we need to install heat pump water heaters is already trained. Plumbers and electricians know how to do this today. They don't need special training to install a heat pump water heater. And there are minimum installation prerequisites for putting in a heat pump water heater. An HVAC heat pump, you might need to get an energy audit. You might need to be doing envelope sealing and putting in insulation. But a heat pump water heater doesn't need those things, so you can speed right to the finish line. This can be budget friendly. There was money in the bonding package last year for heat pumps that is not earmarked as far as we know. And, there's IRA money. The state just got a $100 million award to accelerate the adoption of heat pumps. So if we use some of that to focus on heat pump water heaters, we can speed up the adoption and the interest and the appreciation for what heat pumps can do for our climate problem. And then grid friendly, as we take demand off the grid by replacing inefficient electric water heaters, we can accommodate the uptake from switching fossil fuel water heaters over to heat pump water heaters. Net, it should work out that we're not putting a lot of additional demand on the grid like we would otherwise be doing with just standard heat pumps for HVAC. And then there's this other thing called demand response. And heat pump water heaters are just about ready to be in a big demand response program that our utilities can deploy in Connecticut. And so what happens is you buy a new heat pump water heater today, it comes with a Wi-Fi controller that if the state offered a heat pump water heater demand response program, the utility would sign you up. It would be your option. You would get some money off your bill every month for being in that program, and they would be able to remote control the thermostat on your water heater and turn it down during periods of peak demand. Now think about it. The hot water is still in that tank. You still could take a shower, but it's not trying to keep up and keep that water heated for the next few hours while the grid is under stress. This has been done successfully in California and other states, and it's a great opportunity for Connecticut to reduce demand on the grid at a time when we know demand is going to be increasing. So this is another superpower that can help you sell this as a policy moving forward. And so what are our policy asks? Well, you know, the one problem is this superhero can't deliver by themselves, right? They need the guardians of the Connecticut climate, the legislators, DEEP, PURA, the Energy Efficiency Board, to all pitch in and help make this happen. 0% financing is really important. The reason it's important is that these are expensive upfront. Even people who could pay cash for this find it expensive. So, you know, Massachusetts has a heat program and it's 0% financing regardless of your income, and they have longer payback periods on it as well. This would really speed up the adoption of heat pumps in Connecticut and get people, especially with water heaters, to find out how valuable they really are. We need contractor incentives. You know, 80% of the time you're replacing your water heater when it fails. And in that emergency situation, your plumber comes in and says, I can put in the same water heater you have today with this right now, and that's it. And that's what people default to. We need contractors, just like in the Inflation Reduction Act, contractors were given incentives to push heat pumps. And so, you know, we need to get the contractor incentives in place. Landlord incentives, Massachusetts has done a really good thing by prioritizing in their energy efficiency program incentives so landlords can make it so that renters can afford to save money. And then finally, I think we need both a target of 90% of heat pump water heaters by 2040. They're all going to fail in the next 12 years. Let's replace them with heat pumps and have PURA establish a demand response program. And so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And I really appreciate the specific opportunities for the superheroes to come swoop in and save us over in the legislature. We are going to have one more voice today. Charles, we've heard from multiple folks about the challenges throughout the day too, the challenges we're facing this upcoming session in terms of the financial picture of our state. And I'll speak as a legislator, heard a lot, especially this last campaign, about the public benefits charges and the challenges that folks felt when they saw their bills going up. Can you help us pick apart what's going on with the public benefits charges, the role that they can actually play in these solutions, and what we might be faced with and what we have to get done this year?
Sure, thanks. A great question. And look, cost is certainly a concern. Nobody is going to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the cost of energy. Energy is a very complicated topic, and I think the complexity of the topic is taken advantage of by certain individuals in trying to sow confusion and misinformation. So I guess to start with the public benefits part of the conversation, a lot of press conferences, a lot of statements about the fact that the public benefits charge is somehow an illegitimate line item on our utility bills. And that is why last summer people saw such high electricity bills. Well, what happened last summer? Between the beginning of June and mid-July, we had 3 essentially back-to-back high heat emergencies. So individuals were using a ton of electricity to cool their homes and cool their businesses. And we're all consumers of electricity, so that we all know the more electricity we use, the higher our monthly bill is. It's a per kilowatt charge. So no surprise there. Remarkably, the weather, not part of any conversations. What was part of the conversation, as you point out, was this line item called the public benefits charge. And the public benefits charge is not unique to Connecticut. It's a common mechanism for supporting certain programs, commonly energy efficiency, renewable energy programs, certain hardship programs, including medical hardship. But the focus really was on somehow this is a hidden tax that doesn't belong on our utility bills. Big push now to get rid of it. Well, what would that mean? Well, number one, it would mean that we wouldn't have those energy efficiency programs anymore that we just heard about, saving households and businesses and commercial entities, thousands of dollars. Over the course of those programs, it's been equivalent to about a 44 megawatt power plant. So that's all avoided energy use. And when we talk about the energy efficiency and the renewable energy charges, those are fixed by statute. Those don't fluctuate over time. So they, could not have been any higher than they had at any point previously, because combined, they're about 0.7 of 1 cent per kilowatt hour, less than 1 penny per kilowatt hour. So that has been a lot of misdirection. And I think a lot of people claiming to be energy experts talking about these issues have intentionally tried to confuse the public by providing inapt comparisons. And hopefully one of the things we walk away from today is being more careful consumers of arguments and the information that we hear when it comes to our energy programs. We frequently hear that renewable energy is just too expensive. Part of the support for that argument is to compare the cost of new generating resources to the wholesale cost of existing generating resources. Very much an apples to oranges comparison. You're comparing the entire investment of an energy source to what a generator that, well, I don't know, in the case of Millstone has been operating since 1970, might be able to provide power for. And we know moving forward, we're going to need more electricity. So the comparison really is what will be providing these new sources of electricity, not comparing it to the cost of existing generation. And there's a couple ways to sort of get at that. One way is that we could look at what the cost of infrastructure is going to be to support various new generation resources. Here in the Northeast, frequently here we're at the end of the natural gas pipeline. So if we're going to be investing more in natural gas, which maybe not too many people in this room would support, we're going to have to build pipelines in order to support that. And the latest figures are that pipeline construction costs just hit a peak of $10.7 million per mile. So a recent project in Virginia, 303-mile pipeline project, cost a total of $7.85 billion. It was initially slated to cost $3.5 billion. So the price more than doubled in the billions with a B. The Project Maple project, which is currently under consideration here in Connecticut and New York, estimated to cost nearly $1 billion over the 6-year length of that project. So, I'm not here to argue for or against anything, but just providing the numbers. The current darling of the anti-renewables crowd is nuclear energy. That may not be the lower cost option that people think it is either. Again, the most recent project in Georgia, the Vogel power plants, those that was expected to cost $14 billion to construct those power plants, ended up being more than $30 billion. So again, more than doubled. So cost estimates, you have to be very cautious of. You have to understand that everything has a cost. There are no free lunches. But if we want to compare apples to apples, one really good way to do it is a mechanism called the levelized cost of electricity. So that basically looks at construction costs. It looks at energy or fuel supply costs as much as they can be estimated. It takes the variability of various resources into account. So a nuclear power plant that may be generating more consistently than an intermittent renewable, that's factored in and equalized. So very much an apples to apples comparison. So, offshore wind estimates range anywhere from $117 per megawatt hour to $180 per megawatt hour. So it's a range, a little bit of uncertainty. Nuclear, a low of $88 per megawatt hour. So below the offshore wind. But wait, that Vogtle plant that we were just talking about, it's calculated that the actual levelized cost of electricity there is in the $170 to $180 per megawatt range. So on parity, and much more expensive in terms of upfront costs. So, the notion really is that when you hear advocates, when you hear politicians, when you hear industry representatives talking about what seems reasonable to invest in our energy future, make sure that they're talking about like items. Comparing anything that we're going to build in the future to the wholesale cost of power is misdirection at its worst. We're going to need new resources. We should evaluate them impartially and consider all of the costs and benefits of every resource. But just take a jaundiced ear, I guess, to what you sometimes hear in the public sphere.
Thank you, Charles. I think we're going to wrap up in just 2 minutes here, but I wanted to make sure we circled back and let everyone give their 15-second headline for what you'd like to see happen in the legislature this year. Is it a policy? Is it a perspective? Charles, do you want to start and we'll kind of work our way back, because you were talking about, if it's the jaundiced ear, then we got it. But is there anything else you want to?
No, that's great. And I will say, because I know everybody else is going to have proactive and very good policies to propose, which I will also support. But I will say with my tongue firmly in my cheek that I would like to see nothing happen this year in the legislature, because I'm very much in a defensive frame of mind. I think we're going to have a hard fight ahead of us defending our renewable energy programs, defending our energy efficiency programs from this intentionally misguided assault on the public benefits charge. And, it was renamed the public benefits charge, I think, in an effort to help support these attacks. It makes it seem a little bit like welfare, and that's certainly how the opponents are framing it. What it actually is a systems benefit charge, because the programs and the policies directly support and enhance our transmission and distribution system. And that's why they're on the utility bill.
Thanks for that, Charles. Defense around the systems benefits charges.
I put all the
got?
policy asks on one of my slides already, but
yeah.
I would just say, tackle the pragmatic, the low-hanging fruit, get it done. Thank you.
Hot water heat pumps. Terri, what you got for us?
Religious communities are a real hub in the community, not just people think of them as just a building, but they're really a place where lots of people and households come together. So I hope that legislators understand the impact that any house of worship can have. I'd like to see them protect the public benefits charge, expand our energy efficiency. I'd like them to see them expand commercial solar canopies, and also just continue going for the truth. There is so much misinformation out there, but so is the truth. So the legislators themselves have a bit of a harder row, because they're going to have to wade through the misinformation and understand what is correct.
Truth. All right. Thank you. Mark, what you got for
Let me
us?
tell you what we're not going to ask for this year. Last year, a bill was passed, Public Act 2431, that requires PURA to take a hard look at our solar programs, the commercial, the residential, and shared clean energy. That they have to report back to us about a year from now on that work. That is monumentally important work. Let's not get in their way by coming up with all kinds of crazy ideas now. So we're not looking for a redesign of the programs. PURA is going to do that. You remember the theme was let's rapidly deploy. Let's remove some of the things that are in the way of solar right now. There's an excellent interconnection working group has just come out with a plan. Let's support them. The local property taxation of solar is a huge obstacle. We've had 4 or 5 years of attempts at the legislature. If we can get a compromise on that this year. And the last little thing that would really help churches and schools and towns and businesses is the small commercial program. Take the cap off. It's not an auction. It's not going to lead to any significant increased cost, but it'll help a lot of churches, a lot of schools, a lot of businesses.
Got it. Thank you. So rapid adoption around what's in front of us. And Doctor, take us back to where we began. What would you like to see?
I know that the number 426 parts per million doesn't resonate. Just like what Chuck Nice said, the eggs matter, right? So I guess what I would just like to see is the health perspective stay in the narrative, because I think people can relate to that. I know that when our family put in a heat pump and a water heater, the air quality in our house got immediately better. So I'd like to hear that message come out and counter some of the dominant narratives that I fear we will hear. The other thing is I do think that incentives work. My husband works at the Hartford Insurance. That company is really incentivizing people. So when he bought an EV and when he goes to work, he charges it there for free. He basically drives emissions free and works, and it is covered. I'd like to see companies incentivized. I'd like to see contractors, new home builders incentivized, because people relate to the money, right? So that's what I'd like to see. And just to keep the dominant narrative a little bit at bay.
Thank you for sharing that. Keeping health in the conversation and thinking about incentives. Well, first, let's thank the League for hosting us today and bringing together this important conversation, and everyone for sticking around with us. And I would ask you all to please join me in thanking our great presenters today.